Hello everyone. Thank you for joining the session. This is the 6th session on photography. We are talking about basic photography. So I have been conducting a series of photography related live on Facebook and Instagram alternately. So this is the 6th one in the series. Let's wait for a couple of minutes for a few people to join. So in the previous session, we talked about various camera related stuff, like what are the points you should consider when you're choosing a new camera, what is the difference between different types of cameras, what are the main differences between DSLR and mirrorless, and we also talked about what's in my camera kit and what are the lenses that I use and which are the lenses I use in for portraits and which are the lenses I use for weddings and things like that. So I also gave recommendations on what should be there mandatorily in a photographer's kit when they're starting out. So if you have missed the session, you can watch it by going to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/NeetaShankar, and you will be able to find the session there. You will also be able to find all the previous sessions where we have talked about rules of composition and various topics other than that as well. So we've already had 5 sessions and this is the 6th one. And yeah, so today we're going to talk about various things like what are the points you should consider when you're picking out lenses, and then we'll also talk about a lot about lighting gear, because this is one of the questions I get very frequently. So you can see all the lighting equipment that I've placed here. So I'll be talking about various lighting equipment. I'll also be discussing various modifiers and what I use when and what is my go-to kit in lighting. So hang around and let's have a good session. I see that a lot of people have started joining. Hello everyone. Hi Manish. Hi Gurudat. Hi Naresh. Okay. Great to see a lot of people joining. So like I mentioned before, for all the previous sessions, do check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NeetaShankar. The sessions happen alternately on Facebook and Instagram. So today it's on Instagram, tomorrow's session will be on Facebook. And tomorrow's session is going to be a really important one. We are going to be talking about exposure, how to calculate exposure, how to work with the camera in manual mode, and what are the different, how do you set your aperture, shutter speed, ISO, all these things. So it's going to be important, really important for you to understand how to make the most out of whatever camera you have. So do join in tomorrow. This session will be on Facebook. So our Facebook page is Neeta Shankar Photography. You can search for facebook.com/Neeta Shankar Photography and you should be able to find. Okay. Okay, so we just had like one slide that we missed talking about in the previous session where I talked about camera and lenses. So I'll get done with that and then I'll continue talking about the lighting part. So we were discussing what are the points you should consider when you invest in a camera. So now we talked about various points like things like autofocus, in-body stabilization, and image quality, and to say a few of those. So now we are going to be talking about what are the points you should consider when you're choosing a lens. So the main thing to consider is the focal length, of course. So depending on the genre that you're shooting, you can decide on what focal length range will suit your field of work the most. That is, what would be your go-to lens when you're using, when you're shooting on field. So like for example, if you're a wildlife photographer, then you may not always reach for a wide angle lens when you're shooting portraits, unless you want to make environmental shots and you want to show the wildlife in their habitat. You may not actually reach for wildlife to wide angle lenses. So it's as a wildlife photographer, probably you would want to invest in telephoto lenses and really long focal length super telephoto lenses. So if you are a fashion photographer, you may want to invest in a good portrait lens. Likewise, if you are a wedding photographer, you would want to invest in a good wide angle lens, because that's where you can tell most of the story. And wedding photography is about the story of the couple, the story of the day. So it's very essential to have a really good wide angle lens to start with. Okay, so focal length is one of the things you will consider. Genre you shoot most will influence what focal length you need to pick up. Other thing we already discussed in the previous session as well, you need to check the maximum aperture of your lens. Like for example, right now I have my Z7 mounted with the 24mm prime lens, and this is a 1.8 lens. So the maximum aperture of this lens would be 1.8. So you can figure that out by what's mentioned on your lens. So if you want images where your subject is sharp but the background is really blurry and the background is gotten completely out of focus, then you need to have a lens which has a very small f number, like 1.8 or 2.8, something like that. If you the smaller that number, better the background blur would be. But of course, there is a lot more to it than just the background blur. So we'll talk about all these things when we talk about how aperture influences light as well as depth of field. But it's always good to have lenses which open up really wide, as in which allow a lot more light into the camera, and which allows you to shoot in low light, plus it gives you a nice shallow depth of field. So if you're not let's say if you're a street photographer and you don't naturally shoot with shallow depth of field, you would want to then shoot with more depth to include more elements and layer different elements in your images, then you don't need to consider something which is 1.8. You can as well go for an f4 lens. So you can take a call depending on what genre you shoot. So we also discussed in the previous session, about fixed aperture versus variable aperture. So like I said, this is 24 1.8. The aperture, maximum aperture is fixed at 1.8. So this is a fixed aperture lens. There are certain kit lenses which like say 1855 3.5 to 5.6. So what that means is your maximum aperture varies with focal length. So if you are at 18 mm, your maximum aperture is 3.5, but the minute you zoom into 55 mm, your aperture changes to 5.6, or as you're zooming in, your aperture keeps changing. So I don't prefer variable aperture lenses, because when you're most of the professionals don't prefer variable aperture lenses. Of course, we can make good images with any kind of gear if you know how to use your camera and lens, but when you're shooting professionally, you would want to invest in stuff which is good quality stuff, good optics, and something that would suit the professional commercial work that we do, right? So why I don't prefer variable aperture lenses is because, say you're shooting a scene, you've set your exposure according to the light, and then when you zoom in, when the aperture changes automatically, you have to constantly keep adjusting your exposure based on the change in aperture. So this becomes a little bit tedious. So generally that's why professionals don't work with variable aperture lenses. So it's not like those lenses are completely bad, but it's good to have a fixed aperture lens. The other most important thing when you're buying a lens is its optical quality. So that's why I prefer primes over zooms, because if you're considering two lenses of the same price point, a zoom lens versus a prime lens would be a lot more superior in optical quality, because it has lesser elements, optical elements in it, and without compromising the quality of optics, they can actually build a prime lens much easier than building a zoom lens. So that's why it's good to invest in primes. But of course, prime lenses are a lot harder to work with. I also mentioned this in the previous session as well, because you have to literally zoom with your feet and you have to go closer and go back. So sometimes it may be difficult to move back and forth when you're shooting. You may be stuck in certain places where you may not be able to move, or you may miss the moment when you're trying to move closer and move back. So it's good to invest in primes for the optical quality, but if you're not still very comfortable with photography, then I would suggest versatile all-purpose lens like the 24-70. And when you're picking up a lens, also check for barrel distortion, vignetting, chromatic aberrations, these sort of lens defects. Although these are not a very big issue, but it's good to at least be aware of the limitations of your lens, so that you are able to correct it when you're shooting or when you're editing. So of these things, the property that I dislike the most is the chromatic aberrations, or when there is a little bit of fringing in your images, where when you're shooting backlit images, some lenses produce kind of like a purplish outline, so which is something I don't like, and it actually becomes a little tedious to remove in post. So it's better to check whether whether your lenses exhibit these sort of issues before you purchase. So other than that, you can also consider if your lens has image stabilization or vibration reduction. These are especially important in telephoto lenses, because when you're shooting in slightly slower shutter speeds, and if you want your camera shake to be avoided, especially in telephoto lenses, you may not always be able to follow the rule of hand holding. So then you may want to have certain vibration reduction in your lens, which will remove the shake that that is caused due to you holding it in your hand. So let's say if you're shooting with 200 mm, typically if you want to get really sharp images, your shutter speed has to be at least 1/200th of a second. But we may not always be able to achieve that shutter speed depending on the light that is available. So if you're shooting slightly slower shutter speeds, your camera shake would be recorded, and that appears as a blur in the image. So in such cases, in order to be able to ensure that your images are sharp, it would be good to invest in lenses which come with vibration reduction or image stabilization. Other thing that you have to consider if you're going to be using the lens for a long time is the weight of the lens, because at the end of the day, it is up to you to produce good images. So no matter what kind of equipment you have, if you're really tired and if you're tired of carrying that heavy weight around with you, then you're not going to make great images anyways. So it's better to consider weight of the lens as an important factor when you're thinking of buying something. The other good to have factor would be, if you have lenses with minimum focusing distance, in which minimum focusing distance is really small, so that way you can get really close to your subject and produce some macro images. Now in Z6, Z7, because the mount is quite bigger, and because the lenses are closer to the sensor, because of the the flange distance between the sensor and the lens has been reduced. So because of that, the lenses can actually focus really close, and it actually most often helps in taking some macro details as well. The other most important thing when you're considering a lens should be whether it's weatherproofed or not. Now most of us will think that okay, we may not be we may not shoot in rain or sand or something, but if you're shooting professionally and if you're trying to make some really good images, sometimes you may have to work in all sorts of elements, and it's extremely essential to have a lens that is weatherproofed. well. Okay, so that's about different points you should consider when you're getting a lens. So let me just look through and see if there are any questions. So Swapnil is asking, what zoom lens should I buy if I have to upgrade zoom lens from basic 1855? If you are on the full frame system, I don't think you are, because you are saying 1855. So if you're upgrading to a full frame system, then 2470 is a really good lens. But if you are still on the crop sensor, then I think you should wait it out until 1855 should be okay for your wide angle images. You can wait it out until you want to change your camera to full frame, and then you can invest in a good lens. Also, this is something I forgot to mention. If you are investing in lenses, let's say you have a crop body and you're investing in lenses, don't invest in lenses which fit on crop bodies alone. Like in Canon, that would be your EFS lenses. In Nikon, it would be your DX lenses. Don't invest in these lenses, because those lenses will not fit on your full frame camera when you upgrade your camera. So if you don't mind the 24mm, which would on your crop body, it would probably be around like 35mm. If you don't mind that, you can still invest in a 2470, and it will be future proof, so that you can use it even after you upgrade your camera to a full frame. But those of you who are on crop sensor bodies, don't invest in crop sensor lenses as of now. If you are considering photography as a full-time profession, or as a serious hobby, then you should definitely consider investing in lenses which will fit a full frame as well. Okay, so Karan Arora is asking, best lens for portrait with Z6 for wedding. If you're talking about portraits, I would say 85mm for sure. I use 85mm all the time. If you are talking about everything else in a wedding, then I would recommend something like 35mm or a 24mm or even a 2470 for that matter. Okay. So Priyadeep Surana is asking, I have a Z6, is new 35 1.8 worth it? It's definitely worth it. I love that lens. I use that lens all the time. So 35mm is my favorite focal length, and the 35 1.8 is a really good lens. So you can definitely consider that. So Kirtana is asking, how do we convince people that editing does not make the click look artificial? So the thing with editing is, if you do too much of it, then it does make it look a little artificial. So you have to keep your editing to an extent where most people will not realize that you have edited an image. So if people are thinking that your clicks are looking artificial, then probably you've overdone your editing a little bit. So dial it down, ensure you keep the images looking as natural as possible, so that it does look enhanced compared to the raw image, but at the same time it doesn't look artificial. So Naresh is asking about modifiers. I'll talk about it soon. So Eunice is asking, which is the best lens for product photography? Generally, when you're shooting products, it's good to have a macro lens. So the 105mm macro 2.8 lens would be a good investment. Okay, let me just check if I missed any questions. Okay, so there's one question. As a former Canon user, please advise upon the lenses and their details for wedding and portraits, as I use 5D Mark II. So when I was using Canon, my most used lens was a Sigma 35mm 1.4 art lens. So that was the lens I used day in and day out for all the rituals and all the moments in a wedding. Other than that, I used the 50 1.2 and the 85 1.2 lenses for portraits. So these were the three lenses that I used the most. I think these are the three lenses that will, irrespective of the brand, if you have 35, 50 and 85, you can shoot weddings really well. Okay, there are a lot of questions. Let me just scroll through. So Nishant is asking, why are you using a MacBook? Are you finding any difference between normal PC and MacBook? In our studio, we use both PCs and MacBook and iMac, so there is no difference as such. But of course, I like the way Apple Mac OS is compared to Windows. It's a personal preference again, but we do use Windows PCs for a lot of other tasks, and that works totally fine too. Again, I think asking, whether you prefer MacBook or a Windows laptop is more like asking if you like Canon or Nikon or Sony. So I love Nikon and it is my personal preference. So it's completely up to you what suits your workflow. So Nischal is asking, which one is better for off-camera flash, manual or TTL? I always shoot on manual mode itself because I'm comfortable that way and I know I can control the flash the way I want. Sometimes if you're on TTL, some situations, some scenarios may require you to do flash exposure compensation, so you'd rather do it in manual. So Kadambar is asking, which lens should I buy with Z6 for photography in wedding? You can either consider a 24-70 zoom lens, or you can consider 35, 50, 85. These are the lenses that you can consider. I use the 35-85 combination a lot, so probably that's a good place to start. So a lot of people are asking about sharpness. I will be talking about it in the next class, where I'll talk about exposure and various camera settings and what exactly you should have your camera settings set to for different scenarios. So when I talk about that, I'll also talk about the sharpness part of it. So Riker Photography is asking, what is the mandatory lens during weddings one photographer has to carry? I would say any wide angle lens, be it 24-70 or a 35mm or a 24mm, you need to have at least one good wide angle lens that you can use to shoot weddings, because weddings is not just about close-ups, it is more about showing the entire story and capturing the whole story. So Prathvish is asking lenses for filming weddings. We use the same set of lenses that I mentioned. We use the 35, 50, 85. We also use a 14-30 ultra wide angle lens, because we really love the way the perspective, ultra wide perspective adds in video. It looks amazing when you're shooting with an ultra wide lens. And you can show a lot more by using an ultra wide lens. So other than that, for variety in clips, we also use a 70-200 once in a while, but that's not very often. Okay, I think. So Prabhakar is asking, what's your review about Z7 for still images? I absolutely love my camera Z7 for still images. I especially love the image quality. I love that the autofocus is a little better than the Z6, although most people don't find a difference. I think there is a difference, and I feel more confident when I'm using the Z7. And apart from that, it's a really sharp camera because it does not have an anti-aliasing filter like the Z6. Because of the higher number of megapixels, they have removed the AA filter, making the images a lot more sharper. So that way there are some minor differences between Z7 and Z6, but I absolutely love it for the image quality. I absolutely love Z7. So, but for people who are on a budget, Z6 is also a good camera. We have both. Like I said, we use Z6 very often for video, and sometimes I use the Z6 as my second camera for photo as well. And it's a really good camera as well. So like I said, most people will not notice much difference between Z6 and Z7. So I would say if you're on a budget, invest in Z6 and invest in good lenses rather than spending a lot on Z7. So Manish is asking, best lens for wedding photography. Like I said, I use a wide angle lens. I prefer the 35mm, so that's what I would recommend. So someone is asking, why don't you go more wider like the 1.4? I do use the f-mount 1.4 lenses, but in the Z line there isn't any 1.4 lenses that have been released so far. So, but I've been pretty okay with the 1.8. Like when I was on Canon, I had 1.2 lenses as well. I don't think it matters a lot, honestly. I mean, except for, of course, more shallower depth of field and things like that. But yeah, in the Z line there isn't any 1.4 lens as of now. But time and again I do rent out some f-mount lenses like the 50 1.4 and 35 1.4, and I try those on as well. So it's again a personal preference. So someone else is asking, which lens would be perfect for wildlife? Any telephoto lens or super telephoto lenses would be good for wildlife. So anything more than 200mm, preferably a 400mm or an 800mm lens would be ideal for wildlife. But of course an 800mm will be really expensive, so even a 400mm will be actually expensive. So consider renting out these equipment from any of the rental agencies. So Ratnapriya is asking, now I have 50mm and 24-105, so what next? You can consider investing in an 85mm, which is a really good lens for portraits. So I think that should be your next purchase. Mahendra is asking about retouching software. I use Lightroom, and Lightroom is sufficient for most of the retouching that we do. Almost 98% of the retouching happens on Lightroom itself. So Snapgrapher is asking, Z6 is not in my budget, so which camera should I buy now? You can consider something like the Z50 and slowly build up your kit over the period. Teja is asking about hyperfocal distance. That will be covered when we are talking about aperture and depth of field. So that will probably be in the session on Wednesday. So do tune in on Wednesday on Instagram at 7 p.m. and we'll be talking about that. So Vinay Kumar is asking, I have D7500 with 18-140mm lens. Is it enough to print albums? Yes, of course it's enough to print albums. You don't need a 60 megapixel camera to print albums. Most of our albums will be like maybe 12 inch by 15 inch sort of a dimension, and in which you would have put multiple images. So you generally don't end up printing huge images when you're printing a wedding album. So it's definitely okay to use a lower megapixel camera to print while printing your wedding albums as well. So I think even like a 20 megapixel or 16 anywhere between 15 to 20 megapixel camera also should produce good enough resolution to print like 12 by 15 size images. Priyadeep is asking, which XQD card reader is best for Z series? I use the Sony XQD card reader, and that's been working really well for us. Lal Krishna is asking, difference between Sigma lens and Canon or Nikon lenses. Any third party lenses are going to be cheaper. That's the only difference. Of course, because it's cheaper, and of course, if you get a good copy of the Sigma lenses, their art series are really good. I have used a Sigma 35 1.4 art series when I was using Canon, but be aware that some of the pieces in the market have focusing issues, so it's extremely important you go try that lens and ensure it focuses well before you buy the lens. Like for example, if I'm buying a Nikon lens, I can without any hesitation buy it without having the fear that it may not focus right, because native lenses, that is if you're using a Canon camera, your Canon lenses, or if you're using a Nikon camera, your Nikon lenses will not have issues in focusing, whereas when you're using a third party lens, you have to ensure that it focuses right, especially with Sigma. So so the lens gallery is asking, can you show the scooter in front of your desktop? That's pretty cool. Yeah, I know, this is really, really cool. When I was growing up, this was we had a Bajaj Chetak in our house, and it was the same color as this. So I bought this to remember our childhood days. Okay, so Audi Sandeep is asking, 1855mm kit lens, how can we effectively use it in most of the conditions? It doesn't matter what lens you are if you know its limitations and you can work around it. So when we are talking about exposure, I will talk about how you can utilize your camera and lens, whatever existing gear that you have, to the maximum as well. Okay, I see a lot more questions, but I'll just quickly go ahead with the content. So first things that I want to talk about is all the settings that are there at the back of your camera, and what are the things that we'll discuss about in the future classes, and things like that. So first thing is, when you turn on your camera, you have your different modes. There's auto mode, there's manual mode, there's aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, program mode, and you have some creative modes, you have some user defined modes. So I always shoot in manual, but of course that is because I'm more comfortable shooting in manual mode. But even if you shoot in aperture priority or shutter priority, that is also fine, but try and move out of the auto mode as soon as possible. Try and understand manual mode so that you're able to control your exposure by yourself, because your camera cannot be the best judge of the scene. You are the best judge of what you want to achieve in your picture. So it's extremely important that you learn how to shoot with the manual modes. So that's one of the first things. Of course, I'll talk about all these in detail in the next few classes, but just quickly going over all the settings of your camera. So that's one of the first things that you need to change. And secondly, if you are if you're new into photography, probably you're still shooting JPEGs, but if you want to edit your pictures, if you want to make your images look a lot more dynamic and nice, then you would want to shift to shooting in RAW. So if you're too new to photography and you're scared to start shooting RAW, then you can start with you change the setting to RAW plus JPEG. So that way you will have best of both worlds. If you're not comfortable editing RAW images, you can always edit your JPEG images. So ensure that if you're shooting only RAW, ensure that you're ready to do some post-processing, because RAW images otherwise are going to be really flat, and you need to be able to put in your vision and bring the image closer to what you imagine it to be like, or what you saw in your scene. So raw images will definitely need a good amount, not a good amount, but at least a little bit of post processing. So if you're not ready to post process your images, then you're better off shooting JPEGs itself. So that's the second thing. Then of course there are three major things to your three major settings in your camera, that is your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO. We'll be talking in detail about these in the exposure class, that is tomorrow and day after, but as of now the number that you see on your screen, like on your LCD screen here or on the back of your camera, the number that you see where it says 1/100 or 1/125, this is your shutter speed. The number where it says f 1.8, 2.8, 3.5, whatever it is, that is your f number or your aperture. And then you have the ISO, which goes in like 100, 200, 300, I mean 100, 200, 400, things like that. So these three things we'll learn in detail about what exactly you should set. Apart from that, there are a bunch of other settings in your camera. It doesn't matter which camera you have, every camera will have these settings. So you'll have to just find the equivalent term or the equivalent setting in your camera for whatever I'm talking about. So like apart from that, like I said, there are picture styles, which is like standard, auto or neutral, vivid, monochromatic, flat. I always shoot with standard, because if you're shooting raw, like I said, I always shoot raw. I don't shoot raw in JPEG, I only shoot raw. So if you're shooting raw, you don't need to change your picture style. So no matter what you set your picture style to, it will always the raw image will always be flat, and you will have to do the changes yourself. So and these picture styles can be changed easily in post as well. So I never shoot anything other than standard. Other than that, there is image size, which is like large, medium and small. So I mean, obviously you would want to shoot in the highest image quality. So I shoot large, of course, but since I have a Z7 and this is like a 45 megapixel camera, sometimes I do choose medium, because I don't need that large images. So it's just too data heavy, so I prefer to shoot medium sometimes. So, but if I'm doing a portrait, I would definitely shoot with large. Okay, then there is like the burst mode, which is like single shot or low speed continuous, high speed continuous. So you can choose depending on what you're shooting. If you're shooting really fast action, like maybe sports or wildlife where the subject is moving, it's better to keep your setting in high speed continuous mode. But for every other situation, I prefer to either keep it in single or low speed continuous. Otherwise, just with the press of the shutter button, you'll end up taking too many pictures, and then you will have too many to sort through at the end of the day. And the main thing is there are every camera will have the different focus points, focus areas. So I always shoot with single point focus. I usually move the focus point to where my subject's eyes are, or whichever is my focal point. I move the point of focus to sorry, my dog is here, so he's distracting me. Yeah, so I move the single point to different wherever I want to focus in my image. So I always shoot with single point focus. I don't let the camera decide the focus point for me. That's why I don't like choosing all points in your focus area. So I don't even choose big areas, or I always choose a single point because it's easier for me to ensure that the images are really sharp. So that's one thing. Yeah, so let me just. Apart from that, there are focusing modes, like there is single shot focus, that is one shot in Canon, AFS in Nikon. So what it does is, when you focus on something, it just in one go it just focuses, and then the focus remains there, and no matter, even if the subject moves off, your focus is already locked to that point. But if your subjects are moving within your frame, then you would not get the perfect shot with the one shot focus, one shot focusing system. So in case of moving subjects, you will have to shift to AFC, which is continuous focusing mode. Like in Canon it's AI servo, in Nikon it's called AFC. So if your subjects are moving, ensure you change your focusing mode. So what happens in AFC is that the camera continuously starts tracking the subject. So when the subject is moving, the camera is tracking. So even if the subject is moved from point A to point B, the focus would have shifted to that point. So that way, if you have like a moving subject, if you are shooting people moving towards you, or if you're shooting people moving across your frame, it's better to be on AFC. Apart from that, there are metering modes. There is evaluative, there is spot, there is center weighted. So when I'm shooting portraits, I always keep it in spot metering. When I'm shooting landscapes, I keep it in matrix or evaluative metering. So I will talk about the difference between these metering modes in the next few sessions, but now I'm just quickly going over different settings. So apart from that, the Nikon cameras also have something called active delighting, where you can set it to either off, or you can set it to low, normal, high, or extra high. So what this does is, in case of situations where there's a lot of contrast between highlights and shadows, that there is really contrast light that is there in your scene, the camera tries, if you have set the active delighting to high, the camera tries to recover as much detail as possible in both highlights and shadows. So if you want a more contrasty image where you don't care about details in shadow and highlights, and you want to get that nice contrast between highlight and shadow, then you need to set this to either low or off. But if you want to get more detail in these regions, then you need to set it to high or extra high. But of course, you can change this later in post as well. Apart from that, there is white balance. So depending on the scene that you're shooting, you need to set your white balance. We will talk about white balance in detail in the next few sessions, but just to understand, so white balance is how your camera you use the white balance setting to tell your camera what sort of a light you're shooting in, and how it is the setting which helps your camera determine, to ensure that the white in your image actually looks white instead of another color. So if you're shooting in like broad sunlight, you need to choose sunlight white balance. If you're shooting in cloudy, whether you choose cloudy white balance. If you're shooting indoors or if you're shooting in shade, then you would want to choose shade white balance. So depending on the key light that is falling on your subject, you need to change your white balance. Okay, so that's about all the settings. Yeah, I think that's about all the settings. So generally the way I work is when I'm shooting, I always look through the viewfinder because that is when I get the most accurate focus. But of course, that is because I used to be shooting with a DSLR, and that was the ideal way to shoot with a DSLR. With mirrorless, of course, even you just touch focus on your LCD, even that is really sharp. But because I'm already used to shooting through the viewfinder, that's what I prefer. I also find it less distracting. If I'm shooting through the viewfinder, if I'm looking through the viewfinder, I find it less distracting. I'm able to see the frame end to end and make decisions on composition, what to include, what not to include, and things like that. Yeah, apart from that, okay, if you're shooting on live view, you can enable the touch shutter, touch AF. So that really helps when you want to take pictures quickly by using your finger to just move the focus point. So the way I shoot is, I use these two fingers to, this finger is always on the shutter button, and I use this to change the settings, these fingers to change the settings. And I also I've set the white balance to one of these function buttons, so that way I can just use one of the function buttons to quickly change white balance if I want to. So you can customize these function buttons to do what you want. So the whole idea when you're shooting with a camera is to not keep looking at the back of your screen and fiddling with the settings. You need to be able to change all the settings without taking your camera off your face. So that is something you all need to practice if you are new to photography. Okay, so let me look at questions. So Rushang is asking about lighting for wedding photography. This workshop is not about wedding photography, and I won't be talking about that because this is a basic photography workshop and I don't want to complicate things. Wedding photography in itself is a huge topic. Lighting in itself is a huge topic. So I don't think I'll be covering those aspects. So yeah. Jitendra is asking what gadgets is preferred for jewelry shoot. I would say pick up a good macro lens and a good light and you're good to go. And yeah, if you have a tripod, that will also really help. Mohit is asking, should one consider having a zoom lens such as 24-70 or one can do without? If you're not comfortable with a prime lens, then you can consider investing in a zoom lens. But otherwise, if you have the time to practice and get better with a prime lens, there's nothing like it. So if you have a good set of primes, I think that should be more than sufficient. But if you're very new to this and if you want to take it easy in the beginning, then probably a good versatile lens like the 24-70 will be a good investment. So Mohit is also asking why Sigma lenses and why not the Canon lenses. In fact, all my lenses were Canon lenses except for the 35mm. It's just that when I bought the 35, I didn't have the budget for the Canon 35 1.4, which was double the cost of the Sigma lens. But generally I always prefer the native lenses. Like even now on Nikon system, I've completely invested only in Nikon lenses because I think native lenses are any day better than third party lenses, and it's also easier to, you know, in terms of servicing and in terms of in case your lens develops any issue, it is easier to, you know, deal with a single camera brand rather than multiple brands. Most of the third party manufacturers, lens manufacturers may not have service centers in your city, so it's better to, you know, check that also before you invest in a third party lens. But the only reason you would consider a third party lens is because of the price advantage. If you don't have the budget, then maybe you can consider the third party lenses. Okay, so okay, so we're still talking about all the camera stuff, so we never got around to lighting. So I think tomorrow I'll talk about the lighting part first and then move on to or let me just complete the lighting part now, right? Okay, I'll quickly go over the lighting part now. So it disconnected? 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, so Instagram usually allows us to, you know, conduct a live session at a time for only 1 hour. So in another 5 minutes or less than 5 minutes, I'm going to get disconnected. So before that, quickly, I'll just talk about all the lighting equipment that I use. One is I use a 5-in-1 reflector, like that was one of the first pieces of accessories that I bought, and it's a really helpful accessory to have. It's not very expensive too. Other than that, I use constant lights like the LC500. So this light I use when I'm in a rush and I don't have time to set up flash, or if I don't have, you know, time to figure out, you know, where I want the flash and what power and things like that. If I'm in a rush, I use the LC500. Otherwise, typically the most used equipment of mine is the AD200. As you can see, I've mounted it with a round head because that's something I really like. Apart from that, I use the V1 as an on-camera flash and an off-camera sometimes. So apart from that, I also use the AD600 for like some portrait shoots and for the studio shoots and things like that. Especially I use the AD600 if I'm shooting in like broad daylight outdoors, when I need a lot of power to overpower the sun. That's when I use the AD600. So these are the lighting equipments that I use the most. I will talk about in the next session. I'll talk about what exactly I carry for wedding shoots, what exactly I'll carry for portrait shoots and things like that. So hang around for that. Meanwhile, like I said, this session will also get uploaded to YouTube, youtube.com/Neeta Shankar. So if you missed this session or if you missed any of the previous sessions, you can catch the entire session over there at YouTube. So the next session is tomorrow at 7 p.m. on Facebook. Check for Neeta Shankar Photography and join me live there. Do we have any time? Okay, so I think I still have 5 minutes, so I'll quickly go through some questions. So someone is asking, how do you manage to change lenses during wedding events? You just have to do it. You have to be really fast. I most often use the 35. Sometimes I change to 50 and 85 depending on what I'm shooting. So It's not that hard. I usually carry like a small bag with one extra lens in it, so I'm really quick at changing lenses, but of course it's not very hard. Okay, so Toxic Player is asking, I have a D3400 with the kit lens and I've been using it for more than 3 years. Should I upgrade to a new camera or should just put a tele lens on it? It depends on what genre you're shooting. If you need a longer focal length, like if you like to shoot subjects that are far off and you want a longer focal length, definitely go for a tele lens. Don't upgrade your camera just for the heck of it. If you are finding that your camera that you've overgrown your camera ability and you're not able to work around the limitations, that's when you need to upgrade. But otherwise, if your camera is serving you well so far, don't upgrade your camera unnecessarily. So someone is asking, how about ISO at events like wedding? Like I said in the previous sessions as well, I don't shoot beyond 3200 ISO. I prefer to light my scene with a flash or a constant light instead of increasing the ISO and shooting in low light. Happy Depictions is asking how to deal with the not so good decor and how to achieve great portraits in such situation. We believe it or not, we encounter this a lot of times too. I mean, in such situations, you just have to think minimal, think how you can make use of good lighting instead of good backgrounds. So if you have good light in your images, even not so great background will appear fine. So you need to invest more time in learning lighting, and then you can make good images anywhere. Okay, I think I'm out of time now. Instagram will disconnect this live session anytime now. So it was nice seeing you all here. If I missed your question, come on live tomorrow and ask me the same question and I'll answer it for you. Thank you so much for joining, and it was great talking to you all. So see you all tomorrow at 7 p.m. on our Facebook channel, Neeta Shankar Photography.